Hey everyone, in this video I'll be ranking all the DPS specs for Mythic Plus in patch 10.2. Season 3 is just right around the corner, and I thought I would give you guys my predictions on where all the specs are going to be. I've spent a lot of time doing my own research by looking over logs, seeing what other people are saying, reading tons of stuff over on the respective class discords, and combined all of that info into what I think is a decent attempt at ranking all of the specs going into Season 3. And real quick, before we begin, be sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, so that way you guys are always one of the first to see when my new videos go live. And I just want to put out a quick disclaimer for you guys to remind everyone that these tier list videos, regardless of who's making them, are purely speculation. I don't care who's making the video, all of us are just making educated guesses. Class balance is an ever-evolving thing, and you can make a video on one spec and say how good it is, and then Blizzard can nerf it the next day, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so starting out with the Frost Death Knight. Overall, going into Season 3 for Frost DKs, they're looking pretty good. I'd say that they didn't really receive any nerfs or buffs, so that just by itself is pretty good. At least they're not getting worse. They have a pretty decent tier set, and when it comes to the gains from that tier set, it's looking like with both the 2 and 4 piece, they're going to be getting about a 14 or 13% DPS increase. Frost Death Knights have generally never been really popular when it comes to Mythic Plus, and I really feel like that's probably not going to change going into Season 3 here. And it's kind of a shame because I feel like Frost DKs are actually not too bad. You know, they've got some really good survivability and utility with things like AMS and death grips. However, they are lacking in mobility, and I feel like Breath of Cindergosa is just a little bit hard to manage. And the last thing about Frost Death Knights, they are a candidate for the Legendary Axe, so if you get that, that's probably going to open up a lot of doors as far as doing Mythic Plus. But then again, you're going to be kind of forced into going the two-handed Obliterate build, which I feel like is not a bad thing. Looking at Unholy Death Knights, they've actually seen a lot of changes going into Season 3. It seems like they've kind of adjusted some of the power of certain abilities. Things like Army of the Dead is a lot weaker than it was before, but it seems they have actually adjusted that kind of power into their more short form, kind of bursty cooldowns. Unholy is another spec that benefits from the legendary two-handed axe, so that's really cool. Their tier set is pretty good, and I think they're going to be getting like a 12% damage gain overall from it. And like Frost, they've got some pretty decent utility, they're really tanky, and unfortunately they lack mobility. Moving on to Havoc Demon Hunters. Havoc received a ton of changes this time around. They have gotten a rework on their class and spec, just in general, very similar to Rogues, and they're looking to be really good going into Season 3. Generally, anytime a class gets a rework in one of their specs, they're always OP for that next season. Their tier set is something that I'm not a fan of, however, it's looking to be pretty strong with them getting a 17% damage increase just overall from both pieces. Havoc in general is super mobile, they do some really good damage, and again, they got the class rework, so they're going to be OP. And if they have one con, I would say that if you're going to have to go for the momentum build, I personally think it sucks. Not so much damage-wise, but I just don't like how it plays, and it's kind of risky. On to Boomkins. So Balanced Druids are looking pretty good going into Season 3. They've gotten actually a ton of buffs this time around, so that's really cool to see. As far as their tier set goes, I feel like their tier set is actually pretty good to play around with. Having 2 Starfires or Wraths dealing a bonus damage when you start new fights is pretty cool. And their tier set is going to be giving you about a 15% DPS gain overall. Balanced Druids come with a ton of utility, they've got Mark of the Wild, and they're one of the only few specs that have truly uncapped AoE. However, unfortunately, when it comes to Balanced Druids, their damage is kind of slow to ramp up, and their single target is lacking a little bit. When we look at Feral Druids, just like their Balanced Druid counterparts, they're getting a ton of buffs, so that's always really awesome to see going into Season 3. As for their tier set, it's looking pretty good. The reduction to Feral Frenzy's cooldown will make them feel a lot more bursty and just have that up a lot faster than normal. As far as the DPS gains from both their 2 and 4 piece, they're going to be getting about a 13% DPS gain overall. For some of the pros of playing a Feral Druid, they're super mobile, and just like all Druid specs, they have a ton of utility, which is really awesome. The biggest con I can think of is that you're playing a Feral Druid. And I know that's kind of a joke, but yeah, there's definitely still a stigma for Feral Druids, so just keep that in mind when you're trying to pug groups. Now on to Augmentation Evokers. So Augvokers got some pretty huge nerfs going into Season 3 here. They got some pretty big nerfs to their just overall damage, as well as the abilities that they use to buff their teammates. But I would argue that the strength of Augmentation Evokers is within the utility and just the, amount of spells they have to keep people alive, and those didn't really seem to get affected that badly. So until those actually get affected, Augmentation Evokers, in my opinion, are still going to be incredibly strong this season. As far as tier sets goes, Augvokers have a pretty decent one. It's going to make Prescience last a lot longer, so that's always good in my book. Some of the pros of playing an Augvoker is that, again, they have some really awesome utility and buffing. They're super easy to play, so if you guys are someone that's, new to the game, or you're just someone that wants to make an impact without having to work too hard, this is definitely the spec to pick up. So looking at cons for the Augvoker, they're one of the god comp specs, so I would definitely expect nerfs to be coming in the future for them. But again, as an Augvoker, you really don't need to worry about your DPS, so take that with a grain of salt. Next, we're talking about the Devastation Evoker. So going into Season 3, Devastation Evokers are actually looking really good. They got a ton of buffs across the board to all their abilities. Their tier set's looking pretty good, and they're looking to be getting about a 14% DPS gain, I believe, from both their 2 and 4 piece. Playing a Devo Evoker is really nice because you've got things like Bloodlust and some really good utility, but I would say the biggest con to playing a Devastation Evoker is that you're not playing Augmentation, because the moment people find out that you're Devo and not Aug when you join their group, you're probably going to get kicked. And now moving on to the Beast Mastery Hunter. So going into Season 3, BM's looking really strong. They got a couple of talent tree shifts here and there, and they actually buffed Hunter's Mark to make it kind of like a quote-unquote raid buff. It's not very strong in my opinion, but at least it's a start. What's really nice about BM Hunters is that their tier set is actually looking really strong. Dire Beast is now going to be able to benefit from Kill Command as well as Beast Cleave, so this is going to make your AoE super strong, and that's going to show because it's looking like we're getting a 19% DPS gain from both our 2 and 4 piece, so really good. And then the biggest pro to playing a BM Hunter is that you guys can do your entire rotation while moving, which is really cool, so it's really good for your mobility. And then I'd say the biggest con for playing a BM Hunter is that I guess Hunters in general just have really poor defensives, so you're kind of squishy. When we talk about Marksmanship Hunter, I feel like going into Season 3, they're in a pretty good spot. There's definitely some mixed feelings on Marksmanship in general. A lot of people say that there's definitely room for improvement and they need some pretty good quality of life updates to how they play, which I definitely agree with. I feel like in general, Hunter just definitely needs to, get a nice fresh coat of paint and, get an updated kit as far as how they play. But anyways, we're talking about Marksmanship Hunter. So looking at their tier set, Rapid Fire proccing Volley is pretty nice, and we're looking at about a 11% DPS gain overall. Marksmanship is really good at burst damage, and of course, just like all Hunters, they bring Bloodlust if you have the right pet. But unfortunately, Hunters all suffer from weak defensives, and Marksmanship in general is kind of capped on AoE, so they're not really good at those huge pulls. And for our final Hunter spec, we've got Survival. So going into Season 3, Survival didn't really receive a ton of changes, and I think despite all that, they're actually looking to be in a pretty good spot. Their tier set's actually pretty good. They're going to be getting a free Wildfire Bomb at 100% effectiveness, so that's really cool. And they're actually going to be getting a huge 17% DPS gain overall from both of their tier pieces, so that's really strong. They've got really good single target and AoE damage. However, the big con to playing Survival Hunter is that, just like Feral, you're playing a Survival Hunter, so you're going to have trouble getting into groups. Moving on to the Arcane Mage. So, going into Season 3, Arcane is kind of in a weird spot. They're looking okay, but I feel like not a lot has changed, so it's kind of hard to tell what's going to happen with them. Their tier set's actually really good, and just like Survival, they're getting a 17% DPS gain overall from their tier, so that's pretty good. Some nice things about Arcane is that they've got some really good defensives, and they're also going to be coming with a Time Warp, so that's great. However, I feel like Arcane is just way too complex for what it is, and I just personally feel like it's not very fun. Next up, we've got the Fire Mage. So going into Season 3, Fire didn't really get any nerfs or buffs, so in my opinion, that's awesome. And the really nice thing about Fire Mages is that they just scale incredibly well the further we get into the expansion. As far as the tier set goes, the 4-piece is going to make your combust windows just way more bursty, and it looks like they're going to be getting about a 12% DPS gain from their tier stats. As far as the pros, Fire is going to come with low cooldowns, so they're super bursty. They've got some really great defensives, Arcane Intellect, Time Warp, and of course, Fire's got a cheat death, so that's always cool too. A couple of cons I can think of right off the bat as far as playing Fire Mage. Some people feel like Fire's AoE rotation in Mythic Plus is kind of boring, and the big one I think is that, again, Fire is part of the God comp, so that's more than likely meaning that we're going to get some nerfs if you're playing Fire in the future. For our last mage spec, we've got the Frost Mage. So going into Season 3, Frost is actually looking really good too. Again, no major nerfs or buffs, so that's cool. When it comes to their tier set, if you're someone that enjoys the Glacial Spike build, then this is definitely going to be up your alley. However, I feel like the tier set bonuses from Frost is kind of weak. You're going to be getting about an 8% DPS gain, so unfortunately this, tier is not going to be super good for you. One really big kind of glaring thing about Frost Mages is that you definitely need to be in sync with your tank, because if he's pulling mobs out of your Frozen Orb or your Blizzard, your DPS is going to suffer. Next up is the Windwalker Monk. So going into Season 3, Windwalker Monk I feel like is actually going to be in a pretty decent spot. They got actually some really good buffs across the board for all their abilities in Season 3. However, I feel like their tier set is kind of boring, and they're only going to be getting about a 7% damage gain overall from their tier set, so that kind of sucks. For some pros and cons of Windwalker Monk, they have got some really good AoE damage. It feels like Windwalker's kit is just built for Mythic Plus. They've got great utility in CC. However, I feel like for a big con for Windwalker is their single target is kind of lacking. On to Ret Paladins. So going into Season 3, I feel like Ret Paladin is in a pretty good spot. They didn't really get any kind of targeted nerfs or buffs, so that's cool. Their tier set's decent, and I feel like it's going to help definitely with just AoE and single target in general, so that's really cool. Overall, they're going to be getting about a 13% DPS gain from their tier set, so that's pretty good. Ret Paladins have probably some of the most bursty DPS in the game. They've got some really good utility and defensives, and of course, Ret Paladins are going to be a candidate for the new Legendary Axe, so that just automatically makes them in a really good spot. Their single target can be lacking, and their AoE is not very good for those kind of longer fights. On to Shadow Priest. So going into Season 3, Shadow Priests have gotten some pretty big changes. They've actually gotten quite a few nerfs and buffs, which is kind of interesting. But either way, I feel like they're still going to be in a really good spot. As far as their tier set, I personally feel like their tier set's kind of boring. However, they are getting about a 11% DPS gain from it. Shadow Priests have some really good single target and AoE. They've got tons of utility, and of course they come with Fortitude. However, Shadow Priests are part of the God comp, so that means there's probably going to be some more nerfs down the road. And of course, I feel like their rotation is kind of clunky. Outlaw Rogues are looking really good going into Season 3. Rogue in general got a rework, so that's really awesome. Their tier set's looking really good. The 4-piece seems to have some nice kind of quality of life aspects to it, and Outlaw is getting a 17% DPS gain from their tier set. Outlaw is super mobile, they've got really good defensives, good AoE, a cheat death, and of course, as I mentioned before, they have just gotten a rework, so reworked specs or classes are just automatically always OP in the beginning, so that's going to be really cool. Looking at Assassination Rogues, again, Rogue got a rework, so that's really cool, and I feel like Assassination has got me probably the most excited out of all 3 Rogue specs. So going into Season 3, Assassination's looking really strong. Their tier set is going to be looking really good for AoE, and Assassination's going to be getting about an 18% DPS gain overall from their tier set. All of this combined with the fact that Assassination just recently got another hotfix to their AoE, so I feel like when it comes to, what Rogue spec's going to be best for Mythic Plus, I think a lot of people say it's going to be Outlaw, but I feel like there might actually be a chance that Assassination will do pretty good too. Looking at Subtlety Rogues, I feel like they're going to be in a pretty good spot going into Season 3, but I feel like it's not going to be anything special. Obviously, I think they're not going to perform as well as Outlaw is as far as Mythic Plus goes. Their tier set looks okay. They're going to be getting about an 11% increase to their DPS because of it. Subtlety has always been known for just being very bursty as far as their DPS profile goes. However, I feel like one of the big cons to Subtlety is the fact that I think it just has way too many buttons, and I don't know if the class rework has alleviated this at all, but that's just my take on it. When we take a look at the Elemental Shaman going into Season 3, they actually got some pretty decent buffs, and I feel like Elemental is looking pretty good. As far as their tier set goes, they're actually getting a huge benefit from this. They're getting a 25% gain from their tier set alone, so that's really huge. At least Shamans are incredibly bursty as far as their damage profile goes. They've got some really good utility. However, I feel like Elemental Shamans lack considerably as far as immunities and defensives. So Enhancement Shamans are looking to be pretty good in Season 3. They actually got a couple of talent adjustments here and there, and I feel like they're going to be in a good spot. Because of their tier set, they're going to be getting a 17% DPS gain from it. Enhancement Shamans have some really good AoE DPS, and a really cool thing about them is Wind Fury Totem, so you melee groups are going to benefit greatly from that. However, again, just like Elemental Shamans, Enhancement lack defensives. When you look at Affliction Warlocks, I feel like for them going into Season 3, they're okay. I really don't know if they're going to be super good or super bad. It's kind of hard to tell. However, I feel like with their tier set, it looks like it's going to be pretty good for AoE, and they're going to be getting about a 11% DPS gain from it. As far as pros of an Affliction Lock, they've got really good utility, lock gates, soulstones, hellstone, things like that. However, their single target is kind of lacking, and I'd say the biggest con to beat is just like the Survival Hunter or Feral Druid, Affliction Warlocks have kind of a bad rap in Mythic Plus, so you might struggle to get into groups. Demonology Warlocks are actually looking to be really good for Season 3. They actually got a ton of buffs across the board, so that's really cool to see. However, as far as power from their tier set looks, they're only getting about a 9% DPS gain from it, so they're one of the specs that really don't benefit from their tier set, unfortunately. Demo's got some really strong AoE, they've got tons of utility, however I feel like they're lacking any like hard CC, and their single target setup is kind of difficult. Destruction, just like their Demonology counterparts, are actually looking to be really good in Season 3. Again, they got a ton of buffs, so that's really cool. And it sucks because just like Demo, their tier set is super weak. They're only getting about a 5% DPS gain overall from it, so that really sucks. But Destruction is really easy to play. They've got really good utility, and the only con I can think of for playing Destruction Warlock is that, just like Frost Mage, you really need to have a tank that's mindful of not pulling adds out of your rate of fire. So now let's talk about the true chads of World of Warcraft, the Arms Warriors. So Arms are actually looking to be pretty good going into Season 3. They got a ton of buffs across the board to pretty much all their abilities, which is really awesome to see. Their tier set, kind of on the weak side. They're only getting about a 9% DPS gain from it. Arms Warriors are really good with burst AoE, they've got execute, and of course, they're one of the candidates for the legendary axe, so that's gonna be a huge thing for them. I feel like the biggest con to playing an Arms Warrior is that they're pretty weak as far as their defensives goes. And they're one of those classes or specs out there that, you know, unless they're doing incredibly well for DPS wise, they're probably going to get benched. And last but not least, the Fury Warrior. So Fury is looking to be pretty good in Season 3. They didn't really get a ton of changes, but in my mind, that's actually not a bad thing. Their tier set is actually looking really strong. Fury Warriors are getting a huge 30% DPS gain from their tier set. That's the strongest out of all the tier sets for all the specs in the game, so that's gonna be huge. That on top of the fact that they can get the legendary axe means, I'm telling you what boys, the Fury Warrior stonks are gonna be going up this season. And I know I have them in the B tier for this tier list, and that's just me kind of being conservative with my ratings of these. Honestly, they're probably going to be A tier, at least once they get the legendary axe. I'd say before that, they're still going to be B tier. And that is going to wrap up this tier list for you guys. Hopefully you guys got something out of this one. This was really fun to do, and let me know in the comment section how you guys like this format as far as, you know, talking about the different specs, things like that. And let me know where you guys think I'm wrong or where you guys think, you know, there could be improvements to the stuff in the future. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'm still Solo, and I will see you guys in the next one.